I'm Dave Wallace, and I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I've hauled everything from restaurant supplies to heavy machinery, but nothing prepared me for the load I picked up from a secret military facility in Arizona. The instructions were crystal clear. Pick up a container, don't open it, and drive straight to California. No stops, no deviations. I was told it was a sensitive load, but I never imagined that meant my sanity would be put to the test. It was early morning when I rolled into the facility. The place had an eerie vibe right from the start. The military personnel were a bit on edge, moving swiftly and almost too efficiently, like they were rushing to get rid of me. The container I was given was heavy duty, with security seals and a massive lock. When I started driving, everything seemed normal. The road was clear, the weather was fine, but soon enough, I began hearing something that didn't quite fit the environment. A faint, unsettling noise coming from the container. It sounded like something was shifting inside, a faint scraping or rustling. First, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the truck's engine or the tires on the road. But as the miles piled up, the sound became harder to ignore. I could swear I felt a chill every time it happened. I checked the container briefly during a fuel stop, but everything looked just as I had left it, sealed and intact. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me due to the monotony of the drive. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Hours into the trip, I pulled into a small, dingy gas station off the highway for a quick break. The place was deserted, save for a lone attendant who eyed me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. I figured it would be a good chance to stretch my legs and clear my head. But as soon as I stepped out of the cab, the unsettling noise from the container seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it as I filled the truck with diesel and grabbed a coffee. The noise was like a persistent whisper, a scratching sound that seemed to crawl under my skin. It was as though something inside the container was trying to get out, or perhaps trying to let me know it was still there. The sound was faint but constant, and it seemed to echo with every movement I made. When I returned to the truck, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The lock on the container was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it securely before leaving the facility. My mind raced as I considered the implications. Had someone tampered with it while I was inside the gas station? The thought of opening the container and discovering what lay inside terrified me. But curiosity and a nagging sense of duty drove me to take a closer look. I approached the container cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop. I reached out to adjust the lock, and as I did, the noise abruptly ceased. I paused, my hand hovering over the lock, and tried to listen for any sound that might hint at what was happening inside. But the silence was deafening. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts, and convinced myself it was just a fluke. With a quick glance around to make sure no one was watching, I secured the lock again and climbed back into the cab. I reassured myself that it was just the vibrations of the road and the quirks of the container. Yet, as I resumed driving, the eerie feeling of being watched lingered. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, and the rhythmic thrum of the engine did little to comfort me. The sense of dread was mounting, and the noise, or lack of it, was beginning to weigh heavily on my mind. As the miles rolled by, the unease that had been building inside me grew more intense. The rhythmic hum of the truck's engine was no longer a comforting presence. Instead, it felt like a harbinger of something sinister. The faint noise from the container had started up again, and this time it was louder and more aggressive. It was almost as if whatever was inside was becoming more desperate or agitated. I decided to make another stop, this time at a rest area just off the highway. I needed to clear my head and figure out what was going on. The rest area was quiet and isolated, with only a few scattered trucks parked under the dim lights. I parked in a corner spot, away from the other vehicles, and took a deep breath as I stepped out of the cab. The cool night air felt like a stark contrast to the heat of my anxiety. I approached the container with a mix of trepidation and determination. The rustling noise had become a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I reached out and touched the lock, feeling its cold, heavy weight under my fingers. The moment I started to undo it, the noise abruptly stopped again. I froze, holding my breath, and listened intently. The silence was unnerving, but it was the kind of silence that was thick with anticipation. I decided to take a chance. I carefully opened the container's door just enough to peek inside. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. As I eased the door open, I expected to see something, anything, that could explain the sounds I had been hearing. Instead, the container was empty. The interior was pristine, devoid of any visible signs of disturbance. I leaned in closer, trying to see if there was any hidden compartment or anomaly that could explain the noise. My flashlight beam revealed nothing out of the ordinary. I felt a surge of relief, mixed with frustration. Was I going crazy? I had heard the noise so clearly, yet there was no evidence to explain it. As I was about to close the container, I caught a glimpse of something strange in the corner of my eye. It looked like a shadow, but when I turned my head, it was gone. My pulse quickened as I closed the door and locked it again, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. Returning to the cab, I felt a gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I glanced at the container, I felt as though something was watching me, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. The journey felt endless, and every shadow seemed to morph into something sinister. The road stretched out before me like an unending, dark tunnel, and I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was inside that container was somehow reaching out to me, even if I couldn't see it. As the hours dragged on, the sense of unease I felt seemed to become a tangible presence in the truck. The road was dark and empty, the occasional flicker of passing headlights casting fleeting shadows across the cabin. The constant, low rumble of the engine had become an oppressive sound, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape from. I had hoped that the further I drove, the more the unsettling feeling would dissipate, but instead, it grew more intense with each passing mile. The strange noise from the container was relentless now, a rhythmic scraping and shuffling that seemed to pulse in sync with my growing anxiety. It was as if whatever was inside was actively trying to break free. I could almost hear it pleading, a sound that tugged at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every bump in the road felt magnified. Every sound from the container felt like it was right next to me. I pulled over at a truck stop, desperate for a moment of clarity. The place was eerily quiet. A few tired truckers huddled in the corner diner, and the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the deserted parking lot. I stepped out of the cab, the cool night air a brief reprieve from the suffocating heat of my nerves. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as I approached the container, I could see my breath misting in the cold air, a sign of how badly my body was reacting to the stress. I decided to do a more thorough check. I approached the container, my flashlight in hand, and noticed something disturbing. The lock appeared to have been tampered with again. It was slightly askew, as if someone had tried to open it recently. My heart raced. Had someone tried to get in while I was inside the truck stop? The thought made my skin crawl. I hesitated, knowing that opening the container was against the orders, but my fear and curiosity were overpowering. I slowly unlocked the container and swung open the door, bracing myself for whatever I might find. The moment the door creaked open, I was hit with a rush of stale, cold air. The interior was still empty, just as it had been before. But as I shone my flashlight around, I noticed something unsettling. A faint, dark smear on the floor, like a trail leading to the back of the container. It was too dark to be dust or grime. It looked almost like dried blood. My mind raced with terror. I quickly closed the container and locked it, my hands trembling. I glanced around the truck stop, feeling as though eyes were watching me from the darkness. I could sense a presence, a malevolent force that seemed to be closing in on me. I got back into the truck, trying to steady my breathing. The road seemed even darker now, and the scraping sound from the container had intensified, becoming a relentless, tormenting noise. Every time I looked at the container, it felt as though something was moving inside, shifting and thrashing against the walls. My imagination was running wild, fueled by the fear that whatever was inside was reaching out to me in ways I couldn't understand. I fought to keep my focus on the road, but every shadow, every flicker of light, seemed to morph into something sinister. The journey had become a nightmarish ordeal, and I could only hope that I would reach my destination before my sanity completely unraveled. The hours dragged on like an eternity, each mile feeling like a step closer to the edge of sanity. The once familiar highway had become a dark, twisted corridor, and the constant hum of the truck's engine was now a haunting melody that echoed the turmoil inside my head. The noise from the container was relentless, a disturbing rhythm that seemed to pulse with the beat of my own racing heart. Every bump in the road, every jolt of the truck seemed to amplify the cacophony from within. As dawn approached, I was a shell of the person I had been at the start of the trip. My eyes were bloodshot, my nerves were frayed, and the relentless scraping from the container had driven me to the brink of madness. The sky was just beginning to lighten, but the coming day offered little comfort. I could see the hazy outline of my destination in the distance, an isolated military facility on the outskirts of a sleepy California town. My relief was tinged with an almost paralyzing dread. I was about to unload the container, but I was terrified of what I might find inside. Finally, I pulled into the facility's loading dock, a stark and sterile place with high fences and watchtowers. The facility was guarded, with a few armed personnel waiting to receive the cargo. They greeted me with a clipped efficiency that seemed almost too mechanical. I could tell they were watching me closely, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. I knew better than to express my growing panic, but it was impossible to hide the fear in my eyes. When I opened the container's door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I braced myself for whatever awaited me inside, but as the door swung open, I was greeted by an unexpected sight. The interior was as empty as it had been before. The cold, sterile light of the loading dock revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The floor was spotless, and the dark smear I had seen earlier was gone. My immediate sense of relief was quickly overshadowed by confusion. Had I imagined the whole ordeal? The guards inspected the container, nodding in approval as they confirmed that everything was in order. They seemed unfazed by the fact that the container was empty. I could barely hold myself together as they directed me to unload and sign the necessary paperwork. Every moment felt like an eternity, as if something unseen was still lurking, watching from the shadows. As I left the facility, my mind was racing. The entire trip had been a waking nightmare, and I was desperate to return to some semblance of normalcy. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that container had left its mark on me. Even if I couldn't see it, the doubts gnawed at me. Had I truly experienced what I thought I had, or had my mind betrayed me in the darkness? The drive back to my home was a blur, filled with a profound sense of dread. The container, now empty, was no longer a source of terror, but a reminder of a nightmare that felt all too real. I could still hear the echo of the scraping noise in my head, like a phantom sound that refused to fade. The journey had left me with more questions than answers, and as I pulled into my driveway, I realized that I might never fully understand what happened during those endless miles. The only certainty was that the experience had changed me forever, and the shadows of that night would haunt me for the rest of my days. I'm Jake, and I've been a truck driver for more years than I care to count. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here on the road, but I've always prided myself on being practical and level-headed. When I got word that there was a stretch of road on the border between West Virginia and Kentucky that should be avoided due to unexplained disappearances, I figured it was just another tall tale spun by superstitious drivers. The kind of stories you hear at truck stops, where the lines between reality and folklore often blur. But things were tight. Bills were piling up, and I needed the cash from this job to keep my head above water. The route was a bit longer than usual, but I thought I could handle it. I was on a tight deadline, so I pushed those warnings aside and took the job. I set out just after sunset, the fading light casting long shadows across the road. The truck was loaded and ready, and I was determined to make it through the night, eager to get to my destination in California. The road I was on was a lonely one, winding through dense forests and hills. It was one of those roads where you're surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional flicker of a distant light. As night fell, the darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the only illumination came from the truck's headlights cutting through the gloom. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the trees felt like they were closing in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I'd driven this stretch before, but tonight it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of feeling that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, but I shrugged it off as just nerves. After all, I was experienced and I had driven through much worse conditions. As I continued, I noticed that the road seemed eerily quiet. No other vehicles, no sounds from the usual nocturnal wildlife, just an unsettling silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to the warnings I'd heard. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I decided to keep a sharp eye out for any signs or landmarks that might help me get a sense of where I was. It was then that I began to notice something strange on the periphery of my vision. Shadows moving in the darkness. I told myself it was just the trees swaying, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Despite my attempts to stay alert, the creeping sense of dread was hard to ignore. The road seemed endless, and the darkness around me felt like it was closing in. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, but I pressed on, determined to make the delivery and get this job over with. Little did I know, the journey ahead would test my courage and sanity in ways I could never have imagined. The night deepened as I continued along the winding road, and the unsettling feeling I'd initially brushed off began to intensify. The headlights of my truck carved narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating stretches of the road ahead. But the blackness on either side seemed almost alive, as if it was reaching out to envelop me. I had to keep reminding myself to stay focused, but the eerie silence and the shadows that danced just beyond the range of my headlights were playing tricks on my mind. It was then that I saw them, figures standing on the side of the road, just barely visible at the edge of the beam from my headlights. At first, they appeared to be nothing more than dark, shapeless silhouettes. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but they remained disturbingly vague. The figures seemed to be standing still, almost like they were waiting for something. My heart started to race. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures were following me. Each time I glanced in my mirrors, the shapes were still there, now closer to the road, their outlines becoming slightly more defined. It was as if they were moving in parallel with me, maintaining their distance but always within my line of sight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of prank or a strange phenomenon of the forest. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I picked up the pace, hoping that if I drove faster, I could outdistance whatever was lurking on the roadside. The engine roared louder, The truck's tires crunched over the gravel and asphalt, but the figures remained, now appearing more distinct. They were human shapes, but their faces were obscured, no features, no expressions. Just blank, featureless voids where their faces should have been. It was an unnerving sight, like staring into the abyss and finding it staring back at you. The figures seemed to close in with each passing mile. I could see them more clearly now, standing in the same positions as before, but with an unsettling stillness that seemed almost purposeful. They weren't just standing there. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, though what that might be, I couldn't fathom. The emptiness where their faces should have been felt like an invasion of privacy, a violation of the normal boundaries between reality and something far more sinister. I fought to keep my breathing steady, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was becoming harder to navigate, the turns sharper, and the trees closer. My thoughts were racing, and every bump in the road seemed magnified, sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I could feel my resolve weakening, my mind struggling to find a logical explanation for the horror I was witnessing. But deep inside, I knew that this wasn't just a bad dream. It was something real, something that was encroaching upon my very existence. The fear was suffocating, and the figures were now so close that I could almost make out their movements in the periphery of my vision. It was as if they were getting closer with every turn I took, every mile I covered. I couldn't escape the feeling that they were beckoning me, leading me towards some dark, unknown destination. The road ahead was no longer just a path to my destination. It had become a gauntlet of terror, and I was trapped in its nightmarish grasp. The fear inside me was now a roaring storm, every nerve on edge as I fought to keep my truck steady on the winding road. The figures on the side of the road had become more defined, their outlines taking on a disturbingly lifelike quality. It was as if they were trying to show themselves in greater detail, yet their faces remained horrifyingly blank. Each time I glanced to the side or into the rearview mirror, they were closer, their featureless forms creeping ever nearer to the road. The headlights of my truck seemed to cast eerie shadows that danced and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes. The silence outside was deafening, amplifying the sound of my own breathing and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the asphalt. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the growing dread that threatened to overwhelm me. The more I tried to focus on the road ahead, the more I felt those faceless figures closing in, as if they were drawing me into their silent, menacing circle. I considered pulling over, but the thought of stopping where those figures might be able to reach me was unbearable. The truck was my only shield against the unknown, and I clung to that sense of security with a desperation I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of darkness with no end in sight. The trees that flanked the road seemed to lean in, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out like grasping hands. The figures began to move more deliberately, their shapes shifting with an eerie fluidity. They didn't walk or run. They glided along the edges of the road, their movements unnaturally smooth. It was as if they were not bound by the same laws of physics that govern the world around me. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But the terror that gripped me was too real to ignore. As I navigated a particularly sharp turn, I saw one of the figures directly in my path. My heart leaped into my throat, and I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt mere inches from the shadowy form. It stood there, unmoving, and for a moment, I thought I'd run over something or someone. But when I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness as if it had never been there. The truck's engine idled loudly, and the sudden stillness felt almost suffocating. I quickly checked the mirrors, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The figures had disappeared from view, but I knew better than to think I was safe. The fear had seeped into my bones, and every sound, every shadow, now seemed like a threat. I started the truck again, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. My mind raced with the thought that whatever these figures were, they were not just watching me. They were trying to lead me somewhere far worse than where I was now. The road ahead seemed to grow narrower, and the trees seemed to press in even closer, as if the very landscape was conspiring to trap me. The fear was a palpable force, pushing me toward a breaking point. The faceless figures had become an inescapable part of my journey, their presence a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. Every mile felt like a descent into a nightmare, and I was powerless to escape the clutches of the road I had chosen to ignore. The relentless darkness around me seemed to close in tighter with every mile. My headlights carved narrow channels of light through the oppressive blackness, but beyond that faint illumination, the road was an abyss of shadows and fear. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, and the sense of being trapped was suffocating. Eventually, I spotted a small, run-down rest stop on the side of the road. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, with overgrown weeds and a dilapidated sign barely hanging on its hinges. Desperate for a moment of respite and hoping that a break from driving might clear my mind, I pulled into the rest area. The gravel crunched under the tires, and the truck's engine rumbled to a stop. The sudden silence that followed was almost as oppressive as the noise of the road had been. Stepping out of the truck, I was greeted by a chilling wind that cut through my jacket. The rest stop was eerily deserted, with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. The darkness here was even thicker, with only the feeble glow of my truck's headlights providing any illumination. I glanced around, trying to shake off the creeping unease that clung to me. I approached one of the old picnic tables, hoping that a few moments of calm would help me gather my thoughts. The table was covered in grime and had a few scattered, broken bottles and trash, evidence of its neglect. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing and calm my racing heart. The figures I had seen earlier were still fresh in my mind, their faceless forms haunting my thoughts. It felt like they were watching me even now, hidden just beyond the edges of the light. As I sat there, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I turned my head sharply, half expecting to see those disturbing shapes standing nearby. But there was nothing, just the same oppressive darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of dread was inescapable. The silence was thick, almost as if the world was holding its breath. Every sound seemed amplified, from the creak of the truck's metal to the whisper of the wind through the trees. Just when I thought I might start hallucinating from exhaustion, I noticed something odd, a subtle movement near the edge of the light, something dark and shifting. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the darkness swallowed any details. It was like watching a shadow move just out of reach of the light. My pulse quickened as I stood up, my feet moving almost instinctively toward the truck. When I reached the cab, I glanced back one last time at the rest stop. The figures I had seen earlier seemed to be more pronounced now, not just distant shapes but actively moving closer. I could feel my fear escalating into a full-blown panic. The thought of returning to the road filled me with terror, but the alternative, being stuck here with those figures closing in, was even worse. I quickly climbed back into the truck and started the engine. The comforting rumble of the engine provided a momentary reprieve from the dread, but as I drove away from the rest stop, the darkness seemed to follow me, wrapping itself around the truck like a shroud. The figures remained on the periphery of my vision, their presence a constant reminder that I was not alone. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and I could not shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something far beyond my control. As I drove, I realized that the road had become a living nightmare, a place where reality seemed to twist and bend. The fear I felt was no longer just about what I could see. It was about the unseen horrors that lurked just beyond my understanding. The faceless figures were no longer just shadows. They were a manifestation of something far darker, something that was relentlessly pulling me toward an unknown and terrifying destination. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, an unending ribbon of darkness that wound through the trees like a serpent. My grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, my eyes darting nervously between the road ahead and the shadows that flanked me on all sides. The figures I had seen earlier were no longer just peripheral. They had become a persistent presence, always just beyond the reach of my headlights but never far from my mind. As the night wore on, the darkness grew deeper, and the trees seemed to press even closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out any hint of moonlight. The road was now a narrow path, barely wide enough for the truck to navigate. Every bump and turn felt amplified, each one a reminder of how isolated I was. The fear that had been creeping up on me was now an overwhelming force, gnawing at my sanity with every passing mile. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that might explain the strange occurrences. But all I saw was the same oppressive darkness, with the occasional flash of something moving too quickly to identify. The figures had become more active, their shapes more defined. I could almost make out the outlines of arms and legs, but their faces remained disturbingly blank. It was as if they were trying to communicate something, but their message was lost in the void where their features should have been. Then it happened. I rounded a particularly sharp bend, and for a moment, the headlights revealed something that made my blood run cold. A roadblock made of twisted metal and debris, placed haphazardly across the road. There was no way around it. My heart pounded as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt inches from the obstacle. The metal groaned under the sudden stop, and the truck's headlights illuminated a scene that seemed straight out of a nightmare. The roadblock was covered in dark stains, and there were disturbing markings on the ground, scratches and scrawls that looked like desperate claw marks. As I stared in horror, I noticed something even more chilling. The faceless figures had gathered around the blockade, their shapes more defined and menacing than ever. They seemed to be waiting, watching me with a terrifying patience. It was as if they were orchestrating this entire encounter, guiding me toward this moment of confrontation. Desperate for a way out, I tried to reverse the truck, but the road was too narrow. The figures were now encircling the truck, their movements synchronized and deliberate. I could hear a faint, guttural sound, like a chorus of whispers or perhaps even the rustling of leaves, but it carried an underlying menace that made my skin crawl. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if urging me to understand something that was beyond my grasp. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no escape. I had to confront whatever was waiting for me. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight, shining it into the darkness beyond the roadblock. The beam cut through the night, revealing a path leading into the woods, an overgrown trail that seemed to beckon me with an almost malevolent intent. The figures seemed to be directing me toward that path, their blank faces now almost expectant. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. With no other option, I maneuvered the truck around the blockade and began to follow the path. The forest closed in around me, the trees arching overhead like the walls of a twisted labyrinth. The figures were now moving in front of the truck, guiding me deeper into the woods. Each turn seemed to lead further into darkness, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. As I drove deeper, the sense of dread became almost unbearable. The shadows seemed to move with purpose, their faceless forms weaving through the trees like a living shroud. The road was now a narrow, twisting track, barely visible through the thick underbrush. The fear was a tangible force, pressing in on me from all sides, and I could feel my sanity slipping away with each mile. The path ahead seemed to lead to a clearing, a space where the trees parted slightly. I could see a faint light in the distance, and for a moment, it offered a glimmer of hope. But as I drew closer, the light took on an unnatural, flickering quality, and the faceless figures seemed to close in around the clearing. It was as if they were preparing for something, their presence a harbinger of a final, terrifying revelation. With every fiber of my being, I knew that I was about to face the ultimate truth of this nightmare. The clearing ahead was no longer just a place of possible safety. It was the epicenter of the fear that had been chasing me, and whatever awaited me, there was something beyond my worst imaginings. As I approached the clearing, my heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. The light that had seemed like a beacon of hope was now a flickering, sickly glow, casting eerie, elongated shadows across the open space. The faceless figures surrounded the clearing, their forms moving in a disturbingly synchronized dance. their featureless heads turning toward me in unison as if they could sense my fear. The truck's engine sputtered and groaned as I eased it forward, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. The path leading into the clearing was rough, and the truck jolted with every bump, the sound of the underbrush scraping against the vehicle almost drowning out the ominous whispers that filled the air. The whispers were now a cacophony, a discordant symphony of voices that seemed to echo from every direction, their tone a mixture of anguish and malice. The clearing itself was a surreal tableau. In the center stood an old, decrepit structure, a wooden cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The walls were sagging, the roof caved in at odd angles, and the windows were shattered, their glass long since fallen away. The light came from within, an unsettling, pulsating illumination that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers and the figures' movements. The figures were closing in, their faceless heads tracking my every movement. Their presence was almost suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with their malevolence. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I could not see their faces. Their movements were hypnotic, a slow, deliberate procession that seemed to draw me inexorably toward the cabin. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself for whatever lay ahead. The truck came to a halt at the edge of the clearing, the engine dying with a final, ominous sputter. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, their tone becoming almost pleading as I stepped out of the truck. The ground beneath my feet was damp and uneven, the grass long and tangled, and the air was thick with an unsettling, earthy odor. As I approached the cabin, the light from within cast a grotesque glow across the exterior, highlighting the twisted, gnarled wood and the decaying remnants of what might have once been a porch. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, piercing scream that seemed to resonate with the very core of my being. The figures surrounding the clearing swayed in rhythm with the sound, their movements becoming more frenzied, as if they were anticipating a climax. I reached the door of the cabin, which hung loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as I pushed it open. The interior was bathed in an otherworldly light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The cabin was empty, save for a large, ominous-looking chest in the center of the room. The chest was old and weathered, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to writhe and shift in the pulsating light. The whispers were now a deafening roar, a chaotic jumble of voices that seemed to swirl around me, growing more insistent. It was clear that the chest was the focal point of this macabre gathering. The figures outside were now pressing against the edges of the clearing, their movements becoming almost frenzied, their whispers merging into a singular, haunting chant. I approached the chest with a mixture of dread and determination. The air was thick with anticipation, and as I reached out to open it, the whispers reached a crescendo, a chorus of tormented voices that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. With a final, trembling breath, I lifted the lid of the chest. The sight inside was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. The chest was filled with strange, otherworldly artifacts, items that defied explanation, their forms shifting and changing with the light. Among them were old photographs, their edges burned and curling, showing faces that were hauntingly familiar but twisted into expressions of terror. It was then that the truth hit me with a gut-wrenching force. The faceless figures were not just observers. They were the lost souls of those who had been drawn into this place before me. The cabin, the roadblock, the figures. They were all part of a dark, unending cycle, a trap set for those who dared to ignore the warnings. The cabin was a prison, and I was now a part of its dark legacy. The realization was almost too much to bear. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and the light from the chest seemed to grow more intense, bathing the room in a blinding, searing glow. The figures outside were now pressing against the walls of the clearing, their faceless forms almost contorted with a desperate hunger. In that moment, I knew there was no escape. The cycle would continue, and I would become another lost soul trapped in the eternal darkness of the road. The cabin was not just a place. It was a portal, a gateway to an unending nightmare. And as the light enveloped me, I felt the cold grip of despair tighten around my heart. knowing that I was now part of the horror I had tried so hard to outrun. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Nevada desert, I spotted a lone gas station in the distance. It seemed like a mirage at first, an unexpected oasis in the vast, empty expanse. My name's Rick, and I was driving cross-country, eager to get to my destination but desperate for a break. The road had stretched endlessly, and my fuel gauge was perilously low. This deserted gas station seemed like a godsend. I pulled in, feeling a sense of relief mixed with a twinge of unease. The station sign was barely legible, its letters almost entirely worn away by the elements. As I stepped out of my truck, the eerie silence of the desert night enveloped me. There was no sound but the whisper of the wind against the dry earth, and the occasional creak of the station's weather-beaten sign swinging gently. The gas station appeared abandoned. The canopy over the pumps was sagging, and the glass of the small convenience store was grimy and cracked. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. I walked towards the lone gas pump, hoping to fill up quickly and get back on the road. That's when I noticed her, the attendant. She seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Her appearance was as unsettling as the deserted station itself. She wore a faded uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her face was obscured by a veil of shadow, and she moved with a slow, deliberate pace, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her cap. There was something unsettlingly mechanical about her movements, as if she were a part of the station's desolate scenery rather than a living person. As she went about her business, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. I tried to catch her eye, to engage in some small talk, but she barely acknowledged me. Her silence was heavy and uncomfortable, and her actions seemed detached from any normal routine. Despite my attempts to break the ice, she simply filled up my tank without a word, her focus never wavering from her task. When it was time to pay, I approached the small, dingy counter inside the store. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered with outdated products and dusty shelves. The attendant handed me a receipt and, still silent, gestured toward the door. I took the receipt, nodded, and headed back to my truck, eager to put this strange stop behind me. But as I drove away, I noticed something strange. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, and I had a sudden sense of déjà vu. The landscape seemed to warp and twist, and before I knew it, I was staring at the same gas station again. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that no matter which direction I took, the station always reappeared in the distance, like a cruel joke played by the desert itself. Panic set in. I turned around and tried a different route, but the same desolate station loomed in front of me, more dilapidated than before. The walls were peeling, the paint was chipped, and the neon sign that once flickered faintly now barely emitted a sickly glow. The attendant was still there, her expression as vacant and unsettling as before. The realization hit me with a cold, heavy dread. I was trapped in some kind of endless loop. The station, the road, and the attendant were part of a nightmarish cycle that I couldn't escape. The endless drive through the desert had become a twisted game of déjà vu, with each attempt to leave only drawing me back to the same, decaying place. As the sun set completely and darkness enveloped the desert, I felt the chilling grip of isolation and despair. The once simple task of refueling had transformed into a surreal psychological torment. And as the gas station's lights flickered ominously in the distance, I knew I was no longer in control of my journey. The desert night was deep and impenetrable as I found myself drawn back to the same gas station for the second time. The station's derelict appearance had worsened since my previous visit. What had once been a place of minor discomfort now felt like the threshold to a deeper, more sinister reality. As I pulled up to the pumps again, my heart raced with a mix of fear and frustration. The attendant was still there, almost as if she had never moved, her posture rigid and her gaze fixed on the distance. The atmosphere around her seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I tried to ignore the creeping dread and focused on filling up my truck, but the weight of her silent presence was almost unbearable. Every creak of the old gas pump, every whisper of the wind against the station's metal siding seemed to amplify my sense of unease. Inside the store, The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The flickering fluorescent lights cast erratic shadows across the shelves, giving the space an unsettling, almost hallucinatory quality. I glanced around, noticing that the store's once dusty shelves now seemed more disheveled, as if someone or something had been rifling through the products in a haphazard manner. The attendant's movements were unnervingly mechanical as she processed my payment. Her eyes, still hidden beneath her cap's brim, seemed to follow my every move with a chilling detachment. She handed me a receipt with a slow, deliberate motion, but when I attempted to engage her in conversation or ask her if there was another way out of this hellish cycle, she merely stared ahead, her silence more profound than before. With a growing sense of desperation, I left the store and got back into my truck. The road stretched before me, but no matter how many turns I took, I found myself returning to the same deteriorating gas station. Each time I circled back, the station looked even worse. Broken windows, sagging roofs, and an overall sense of neglect that seemed to feed on my growing panic. The more I tried to escape, the more the station seemed to manipulate my surroundings. The road appeared to stretch endlessly, with no sign of change in the landscape. The same grim shadows and haunting silence pressed in on me from all sides. The sensation of déjà vu grew more intense. It was as if the very fabric of reality was warping around me, trapping me in a loop with no apparent way out. My attempts to break free from this nightmare were becoming increasingly frantic. Each loop through the desert felt like a descent further into madness. The gas station, with its eerie, flickering lights and its silent, enigmatic attendant, seemed to draw me in like a spider luring its prey. Every time I saw the station, it was as if it were mocking my attempts to leave, feeding on my growing fear and confusion. I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The once familiar landscape now seemed alien, with bizarre, shifting shadows and distorted shapes that danced at the edges of my vision. The gas station appeared to be alive, feeding off my anxiety and becoming more menacing with each visit. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, where time itself had become fluid and untrustworthy. The oppressive atmosphere made it hard to think clearly. My attempts to reason with myself, to remind myself that this was just a hallucination or some trick of the mind, were futile. The gas station's increasingly grotesque appearance and the attendant's unnervingly detached demeanor were too real to ignore. As the night wore on, I felt the creeping sense that this place was not just a physical location but a manifestation of my deepest fears, feeding off my desperation and entangling me further in its relentless grip. As the night deepened, the desert around me seemed to dissolve into an abyss of shadows. Each time I drove past the gas station, its form seemed to grow even more twisted and unnerving. What had once been an unsettling experience was now becoming a full-blown psychological torment. The road, which should have been a path to freedom, now felt like a labyrinth with no exit. I pulled up to the gas station for the third time, and this time the feeling of dread was almost tangible. The station looked worse than ever. The canopy over the pumps had collapsed further, and the walls were covered in dark, creeping stains that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was colder now, and the wind carried a mournful howl that seemed to echo through the desolate expanse. The attendant was still there, her presence almost ghostly in the dim light. Her eyes, still hidden beneath the brim of her cap, seemed to flicker with a strange, almost malevolent intelligence. She moved with a deliberate slowness that made her seem more like a specter than a person. The silence between us was thick, filled with a palpable tension that made my skin crawl. Inside the store, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. The shelves were even more disheveled than before, with items scattered haphazardly as if someone, or something, had been rummaging through them in a frenzy. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and every breath seemed to draw in more of the station's growing malevolence. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that this was all in my head. Maybe the fatigue and stress were playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back to the truck, the reality of the situation was undeniable. The road, which should have offered a sense of escape, was now a cruel joke. No matter which direction I took, I always ended up back at the same decrepit station. The sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. It was as if time itself was unraveling, with each repetition of the journey adding another layer of horror. The gas station seemed to be feeding off my fear, growing more nightmarish with each passing moment. The walls appeared to close in, and the shadows seemed to reach out, distorting the world around me into something unrecognizable. My mind began to fracture under the strain. The road, which had once been a familiar and comforting path, now felt like a sinister trap. The gas station was no longer just a place, but a living entity that was toying with me, trapping me in its nightmarish cycle. I could feel the oppressive weight of its influence pressing down on me, making it harder to think clearly and to separate reality from the hallucinations. As I drove through the darkness, the shadows around me seemed to grow more malevolent. They moved and twisted in ways that defied logic, and the eerie howling of the wind became a chorus of whispers that seemed to speak directly to my fears. I felt as though I was being watched, not just by the attendant, but by some unseen, malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the edge of my vision. The gas station's presence was becoming inescapable, a nightmarish anchor that bound me to its ever-deteriorating reality. The more I tried to escape, the more the station seemed to tighten its grip on me. It was as if the boundaries of time and space had dissolved, leaving me trapped in a nightmarish loop with no hope of escape. In the midst of my growing despair, I realized that the gas station was not just a physical location, but a manifestation of my deepest fears and anxieties. It had become a living nightmare, feeding off my panic and confusion, and I was helplessly ensnared in its relentless grasp. The cycle continued, each iteration of my attempts to leave the gas station only serving to deepen my sense of dread. By the fourth visit, I felt as though the desert itself was closing in on me. The once familiar landscape had become a distorted maze, with the gas station at its heart, mocking my every attempt to escape. As I pulled up to the gas station yet again, the changes were even more pronounced. The structure seemed to be disintegrating before my eyes. The paint on the walls had peeled away completely, revealing raw, rotting wood beneath. The windows, once merely cracked, were now shattered, and the remnants of the glass crunched underfoot as I approached the entrance. The smell of decay was overpowering, a nauseating mix of mildew and something darker, more acrid. Inside the store, the oppressive atmosphere had reached a new level. The lights flickered erratically, casting unsettling, strobe-like shadows that danced across the walls. The shelves were nearly empty now, with only a few scattered, dusty cans and broken bottles remaining. The floor was strewn with debris, and a strange, sticky substance seemed to seep from the cracks in the tiles. The air was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been breathed in years. The attendant was still there, her presence now more unnerving than ever. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each action required an immense effort. She barely glanced at me as she went about her tasks, her eyes hidden in shadow. There was a strange, almost mechanical quality to her actions, as if she were performing a ritual rather than simply working. My sense of reality was beginning to fracture. I could feel the lines between the physical world and my perception blurring. As I filled up my truck, I noticed that the gas pump had become increasingly worn, with rust and grime caking the metal. The fuel nozzle felt cold and slippery in my hand, and the sound of the gasoline gurgling into the tank was strangely distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. I tried to engage the attendant in conversation, desperate for some form of connection or reassurance. I asked her if there was another route out of this nightmare, if there was any way to break free from the cycle. Her responses were vague and cryptic, filled with strange half-truths and evasive answers. Her eyes remained hidden, and she seemed to be speaking in a language that I couldn't fully comprehend. As I left the store and got back into my truck, the sense of entrapment grew more acute. The road, which had once seemed like a lifeline, now felt like a cruel joke. No matter which direction I took, I always found myself back at the same decrepit station. Each time I arrived, the station looked worse, as if it were actively feeding on my despair and growing more malevolent with each passing moment. The shadows around me seemed to shift and grow more aggressive. They reached out, curling around the edges of my vision, whispering in voices that were both familiar and alien. The wind carried eerie, disjointed whispers that seemed to speak directly to my fears, intensifying my sense of isolation. I began to lose track of time. The once predictable patterns of day and night had become meaningless. The desert was a vast, unending void, with the gas station as its focal point. My attempts to escape felt increasingly futile, and the station's grip on me grew tighter, more suffocating. The boundaries of reality seemed to be dissolving, leaving me trapped in a nightmarish loop that I could neither escape nor fully understand. As my sanity frayed, I began to question whether this was a twisted form of punishment or a test of my own psychological limits. The gas station had become a malevolent entity, feeding off my fear and confusion, and the more I struggled, the more it seemed to revel in my suffering. The sense of hopelessness and despair grew with each visit, and I felt myself slipping further into a state of delirium. By the fifth visit, my mind was unraveling in ways I couldn't have imagined. The gas station had become a nightmarish anchor, and my attempts to break free had only led me deeper into its dark grip. The desert around me had taken on a surreal, oppressive quality, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into a void of despair. As I approached the gas station this time, it was almost unrecognizable. The once familiar structure had deteriorated to the point where it seemed like a twisted mockery of its former self. The roof was caving in, and the walls were covered in grotesque, pulsating growths that oozed a foul-smelling substance. The flickering lights, which had been unsettling before, now cast eerie, undulating shadows that seemed to reach out and grasp at me as I approached. Inside the store, the air was even more suffocating than before. The stench of rot and decay was overpowering, mingled with an underlying scent of something metallic and acrid. The lights flickered with an erratic rhythm, creating a strobe effect that made it difficult to focus. The shelves were now nearly empty, with only a few broken items left scattered among the debris. The floor was covered in a thick, black sludge that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. The attendant was still there, but she had become something almost unrecognizable. Her movements were jerky and disjointed, and her once hidden eyes now glowed with a strange, otherworldly light. She seemed to be watching me with a disturbing, predatory intensity, her gaze following my every move with an unsettling awareness. As I filled up my truck, I tried to make sense of what was happening. The gas pump seemed to be malfunctioning, with the gasoline flowing in irregular spurts and making a strange, gurgling noise. The sight of the fuel bubbling in the tank was hypnotic, almost like it was trying to draw me in and trap me further. I attempted to engage the attendant in conversation once more, desperate for any form of understanding or escape. Her responses were even more cryptic and disjointed than before. She spoke in a low, eerie voice, her words a jumble of half-formed phrases and unsettling murmurs. It was as if she were speaking from another reality, her voice echoing with a haunting resonance that sent chills down my spine. As I finished filling up and prepared to leave, I noticed something alarming. The road signs that had once marked the way now appeared twisted and distorted, their messages indecipherable. The road itself seemed to shift and change as I drove, the familiar landmarks disappearing and reappearing in different locations. It was as if the very fabric of reality was warping around me, making every attempt to navigate a futile exercise in frustration. The sense of being watched grew more intense. Shadows seemed to move on their own, slithering along the edges of the road and merging with the darkness. The whispers on the wind became louder and more insistent, their voices a cacophony of fear and confusion that gnawed at my sanity. I felt as though the gas station was a living entity, feeding off my growing terror and drawing me deeper into its nightmarish embrace. In my growing desperation, I began to question my own perceptions. Was I losing my mind, or was this place truly a nexus of malevolent energy, warping reality and trapping me in its sinister grasp? The gas station's presence had become all-consuming, a relentless force that seemed to mock my every effort to escape. My sense of time had become distorted, and the once familiar world outside the gas station felt increasingly alien and hostile. The horror of my situation was compounded by the realization that I might never escape this hellish loop. The gas station, with its grotesque decay and haunting presence, had become a prison from which there was no apparent escape. Each attempt to flee only led me back to the same nightmarish reality, reinforcing the feeling that I was trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. The sixth visit was like stepping into a twisted mirror of reality, where everything had escalated to an almost unbearable degree. As I approached the gas station, I could barely recognize it. The structure had transformed into a grotesque caricature of its former self. The walls were now warped and crumbling, and a sickly greenish light emanated from within, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the desolate landscape. Inside the store, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with a heavy, damp fog that clung to my skin and made it hard to breathe. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting rapid flashes of light that seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm. The shelves were now almost completely empty, save for a few twisted, decaying items that seemed to writhe slightly, as if they were alive. The floor was covered in a dark, viscous sludge that had the consistency of tar, and each step felt like walking through a sea of nightmares. The attendant, if she could still be called that, was now an almost spectral presence. Her form seemed to shift and flicker, blending with the shadows around her. Her eyes, once hidden in shadow, were now glowing with an unsettling, otherworldly light. She moved with an unnatural grace, her actions almost choreographed, as if she were performing a ritual rather than merely working. Her gaze was intense, filled with a predatory hunger that made my skin crawl. I tried to communicate with her, hoping for any shred of understanding or relief, but her responses were even more disturbing. Her voice was a low, chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She spoke in a strange, rhythmic cadence, her words a mix of cryptic phrases and ominous warnings. It was clear that she knew far more about this place than she was willing to reveal, and her vague, enigmatic answers only deepened my sense of dread. As I prepared to leave, the road signs outside had become completely unrecognizable. They were twisted into grotesque shapes, their messages obscured by layers of grime and decay. The road itself seemed to shift and warp with every turn, and the familiar landmarks had disappeared, leaving me disoriented and lost. The once straight path now twisted into a labyrinth of darkness, with no clear direction or way out. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Shadows moved and coiled around the edges of my vision, seeming to stretch and reach out as if trying to pull me into their depths. The whispers on the wind had become a cacophony of despair, their voices a relentless drone that gnawed at my sanity. The desert, once a vast expanse of empty space, now felt like a living, breathing entity, its hostile presence closing in on me with every passing moment. In my growing desperation, I felt a chilling realization. The gas station was not just a place but a manifestation of my deepest fears and anxieties. It had become a nightmarish entity, feeding off my terror and confusion, and trapping me in an endless cycle of torment. The boundaries between reality and illusion had completely dissolved, leaving me trapped in a perpetual state of horror. As I drove through the darkness, my mind was slipping into a state of complete disarray. The road, the gas station, and the desert had all merged into one nightmarish whole, a twisted reflection of my own psychological breakdown. The sense of hopelessness was suffocating, and I could feel myself being drawn deeper into the gas station's malignant influence. Each attempt to escape only seemed to reinforce my entrapment, making the gas station an inescapable prison of fear and despair. The final, horrifying realization struck me with full force. I might never escape this hellish loop. The gas station, with its grotesque decay and malevolent presence, had become a prison from which there was no escape. I was trapped in an endless cycle of horror, where each attempt to break free only led me back to the same nightmarish reality. The gas station was not just a place but a living nightmare, a manifestation of my deepest fears that had become an inescapable prison of my own making.